Hey everybody, welcome to the Heel Toe YouTube channel. Today I'm installing an ATLP J-Pipe on Pedro's Accord. It's a 9th generation Accord Coupe that we previously installed an ATLP quad catback system on, and now he wants J-Pipe. So I thought I'd make this quick video just to show you some tips and tricks on making sure that your J-Pipe installation is the most successful it can be. You can get a little hung up on things here and there, so I'm just going to point out a few quick tips for you. Everybody kind of knows how to install a simple exhaust pipe, but sometimes there are a few tips that will help you get through it just a little bit easier. Okay, so just to review, this is the underside of a V6 Honda or Acura. This is specifically a 9th generation Accord, but they all kind of look fairly similar in that you've got a bank in the front and a bank in the back where the catalytic converters from the engine come straight down. And then you got a J-pipe that is basically the merge pipe for those two banks to come together. And usually comes along here, you get a little catalytic converter and then bolt up to the exhaust system. Now some cars like the previous generation Accord and earlier TLs and stuff actually have another flange here, and the converter is a separate piece. So this J-pipe will have to replace this converter as well. There are a couple different options for that on our website, 2 different pipes available, but basically this one is going to have that cat pipe incorporated. Also, this is the only J-pipe that we have currently that uses an oxygen sensor in the front tube here. The position is basically the same as stock, so it reads the same and really doesn't cause any engine lights. We're just going to have to make sure that we loosen this oxygen sensor and move it to the new J-pipe where there's a bung for that to attach there. So what's different with the ATLP J-pipe? You can see the merge section is more tapered and it's got more volume to it. And this pipe that comes around from the rear bank is a nice mandrel bent U shape that merges smoothly with the exhaust gases from the front bank, versus on the factory J-pipe, the rear bank sort of just slams right in almost at a 90-degree angle. It's a little bit less than 90 degrees, so it's not like it's just a completely inefficient J-pipe, but certainly there is some opportunity available with a little bit larger piping, a smoother merge, and of course the ATLP has a 3-inch connection at the back of it that will fit with the factory exhaust, or in this situation it mates up to the 3-inch ATLP J-pipe, the 3-inch ATLP catback that we installed previously. Just for a quick review, you can see that we've got a resonated system here, and it's 3-inch all the way back to this split where it goes Y into the 2 ATLP mufflers. The ATLP exhaust system features quad tips that replace the oval tips on the original car. We have another video where we installed this exhaust system, so make sure you check that out if this system is of any interest to you at all. But again, the ATLP J-pipe will connect to any other factory flange or factory style flange that you would have here. Okay, so now for our tips and tricks. I've got 10 of them for you. The first one is use penetrating spray on all of the hardware on the exhaust parts before you try loosening any of them. Even if they don't really look like they're very corroded, using a little bit of PB Blaster or some other kind of penetrating spray is going to cause these nuts to come off a lot more smoothly without seizing up or getting stuck or stripping the bolts or any of that. So I recommend putting some penetrating spray on anywhere that you're going to do any screwing or unscrewing. This will leak in to the threads and just create a little bit of extra slipping and an ability to loosen those nuts a little easier. And let that sit on there for a few minutes before you try taking them off. Okay, the next tip that I have for you is to make sure that the exhaust system isn't too hot. If it's really hot and you can't, touch it or handle it, then sometimes it makes these pieces of hardware a little bit more difficult to get off. It is true that a little bit of heat can help break these things loose if you're having trouble. However, if the whole thing is too hot, then everything's kind of like expanded and contracting at different rates while you're trying to work on it. Plus you can't touch it and hold on to it. It just makes it more difficult if the exhaust system is too hot. So I like to let it cool down. A good rule of thumb is if you spray penetrating spray on here and it kind of smokes or evaporates off, maybe a little bit too hot. So let it cool down a little bit before you start working on it. Okay, so tip number 3 when you're installing these exhaust parts, or really any parts at all, is to make sure that you got the right stuff. Before I've even taken any hardware off or done much manipulation with this pipe, I kind of want to make sure that I've got a gasket for each port there, and that I've got the right kind of hardware available for putting this thing on. And then it just sort of like line it up here and make sure that it all looks like I got all the right flanges and that O2 sensor is going to bolt up the way that it's supposed to. So just double check and make sure you got the right parts, because if you have to exchange something, it'll create a lot more of an easy time for you if you don't have to, you know, take this thing back off again and then you send it back to us and it's been, you know, nuts and bolts put on there and you've scratched it up and stuff. You know, just kind of give it a good look before you go putting it on to make sure you got the right thing. Okay, the next tip that I have for you is tools. You want to make sure you're using the right tool for the job here. Something that fits on the fasteners correctly. If it's a little bit loose or something like that, or not completely engaged because the nut is a little bit rounded or whatever, you're just going to make things worse by putting force on it with the wrong tool. So make sure you have the right tools that fit over the nuts and bolts appropriately. And then also, I would recommend that if you have to use an extension piece like this, go with 1/2 inch drive hardware instead of 3/8, because you're going to lose a lot of torque on a 3/8 inch extension. Especially with these pipes up here, there's not a lot of room to reach your tool in. You'll want to use a smaller socket, but make sure you got a beefy extension. Whew. Also, it can be a little difficult getting these things off. I do recommend going by hand though, and use a really long breaker bar. If you put a power tool on here like an impact wrench, you're going to put a lot of extra force and hammering on those things, and that's actually going to heat up the nuts and studs to the point where they might actually seize themselves on there, and then you're going to end up breaking the stud. So I do recommend using hand tools for these really difficult nuts and bolts with a nice breaker bar. For my 5th tip, you'll find that some exhaust pieces, actually pretty much every exhaust, but also a lot of J-pipes will have rubber hangers where it's supporting the J-pipe. So you're going to want to use some silicone spray to just kind of put a little bit of extra slippage in those areas, because after a while the rubber gets really stuck to the metal and it's hard to get it off of there. So I do like to take all the hardware off and then do the rubber bushing part of it last, because it kind of will help hold the pipe in place while you're working underneath the car. You're probably working on the ground and don't have a lift like this, but it'll make it easier to manipulate the pipe as it comes off if it doesn't just fall down on you. So I try to do the bushings sometimes first, sometimes last. It just sort of depends on what I'm working on. In this particular situation, I think I'm going to do that one probably towards the end. But by the time I get to it, this silicone spray will have kind of worked its way in between the rubber and the metal and make them slip off quite a lot easier. All right, so now's the moment of truth. We got the old pipe off and we're going to put the new one on. So the tip here is that you're going to kind of go straight on with it, but you are going to have to kind of jimmy it just a little bit, because sometimes these pipes don't all fit exactly the same. There's a tolerance on the car, there's a tolerance in the factory pipe, and there's a tolerance in this pipe too. And I think these bolt holes are just slightly smaller than the factory ones, so it makes it kind of tricky to line things up. The number one complaint that I get is, oh, it doesn't fit on my factory converters. It's like way off and doesn't fit. And the trick to that is to go straight on. So if you've ever put on parts like this before, what you do is you'll come up here and put it on the studs, right? Get a nut started and then find out all the way here. If you can see, it's way off, right? Like there's no way that these bolts will fit in here because of how far off they are, right? Now, if we do the opposite and line it up with these bolts, you know, boom, 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 start it with a nut and come over to the front and look at how far off it is. So that's why what we're going to do is just sort of hang up the rear of the pipe on the tips of the studs, right? So that's barely on there. And then in the front, we just kind of have to bend and tweak it just a little bit to get it to pop on. And this is where the lift really comes in handy. There you go, see? I've got the studs engaged in the holes in the front and in the back. So now, pop it in place. You'll also notice that those are the very first places that I engaged the pipe, right? So I haven't done anything on the back yet or put that rubber hanger on. So this is how you go with this. The next tip is don't forget to put the gaskets in, because you can see that I went ahead and forced that pipe on there. It didn't take a ton of force, but I got it on, and now I'm gonna have to take it off again because I forgot to put the gaskets in there. Okay, the next tip that I've got for installing this J-pipe is when you go to put the factory hardware back in place here, make sure you start them by hand. You don't want to get in a situation where you've put the power tool on it right away and then it starts getting seized and hung up and all that. It's really easy for these things to go on just slightly crooked, and even just like this, you'll run a risk of stripping that nut out. The other thing is that the factory nuts are flanged, and it might be a little tight to some of the pipes here, so you may need to separate the pipe flanges from each other to sneak the nut on, because they may not go on perfectly if you don't. If you've already got it seated in place. So there you go. Just start all this stuff by hand first and then slowly go with hand tools. I would not suggest using impact gun or anything like that on these until you got them really well threaded on, and really just torque them by hand. That's just the best policy all the way around, because these are very sensitive to stripping. And to replace them, it's a real pain in the ass. But I do want to point out that while a 3/8 inch extension isn't the best for breaking things loose because it will twist and you won't get the full torque capacity to the hardware, I do like installing with the smaller one because it limits the amount of torque that you're going to put on there, less risk of breaking something. Okay, so now for installing this oxygen sensor, and really not just in this J-pipe, but in any one of these pipes, you'll notice that there are crush washers at the head of the sensor. It's not really typical that you would replace those in this situation. If you just tighten it down and crush those washers, you'll get a good seal. But the tip here doesn't really have to do with that. It has to do with threading this in. As you can see, the sensor is clipped in place above. You can always unclip it to make your job a little easier, and here the clip is pretty easy to access. But sometimes you can't do that, and so the tip is to actually counter turn the oxygen sensor, twist it, and twist up the wires a little bit. Try to go about as many turns as it would take to install the part, and then when you go to thread it in place, the wires should be more or less in a natural position when you're done tightening it, and they won't be all twisted. So pre-twist, anti-twist your oxygen sensor wire before you go to tighten it down and install it. And when you tighten the oxygen sensor, you're just looking to squish those crush washers, and then you're done. The next thing to watch out for is to make sure you don't have any contact with anything. If you're hitting any heat shields or brackets or anything like that, it'll create a rattling sound and it'll be super annoying. Also, you could double check to make sure everything is tight so you don't have any leaks. A leak here will kind of sound like a puffing or maybe even a motorboat kind of sound if it's a really bad leak. You can idle the car and feel around some of the flange areas and notice if there are any actual obvious leaks. Pinholes in these areas are usually not a big deal. Sometimes it just happens, but you know, if you do need to just sort of tack something, it's not usually a huge deal, but definitely let us know if you have a problem like that. And for the last step, I like to use some kind of a cleaner, spray polish, brake clean, something like that to get off all of the fingerprints and other evidence that you've touched it. Because when this pipe gets nice and hot, it'll color change, and it'll look pretty ugly if you have fingerprints and stuff all over there. Not that you'll be able to see it anyway, but it's just sort of like a nice finishing touch to put on any exhaust installation, is to just sort of wipe it down real quick and have a nice clean looking pipe. I am using this Honda spray cleaner and polish. This stuff is really amazing. I love it. We do sell it in the store. It does a great job on any plastic or metal or painted areas or anything on the car you can use this for. It's actually a power sports product. It's meant for sort of cleaning off your motorcycle. It'll take off bugs, road tar, dust off of basically any surface on a motorcycle or a Honda car. Okay, with the J-Pipe on, we're ready to go test drive the car and make sure we don't hear anything weird sounds or anything like that. My last tip was just more a piece of advice, I guess, which is your old J-Pipe, I would recommend holding on to it and not getting rid of it. Don't throw it away or anything like that, because worst case scenario, what if something happens to this one, or I don't know, some kind of issue happens. Maybe you want to sell the car, take your ATLP J-Pipe off and resell it, because they actually do hold the resale value really pretty well. You'll want something to put back on there. So I like to make sure that I tuck away the old spare parts that I have, just to make sure I have them in case I need them again. Everybody's kind of got their own opinion on that. They do take up space, so whatever. Thank you a ton for watching this video. Make sure you check out the description below for links to the products that I talked about here, as well as a coupon code to get a discount on your very own ATLP parts on HeelToeAuto.com. Heel Toe's in your corner. Have a great day.